All right. It's on my Manila time. It's 1:05. We're 2:05 in Korea, so I think we can start the session now. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for some. So let's begin. My name is Ayessa Nilong. I'll be moderating the session today. I hope you can all hear me clearly. If not, please feel free to put it in the chat. Um, I'm a program assistant at the Secretariat of Migrant Forum in Asia, based here in Manila, Philippines. I hope you're all doing well despite the circumstances. So we're about to go into a discussion on migration and inclusive democracy as part of the Gwangju Democracy Forum, which started last Monday, where we are taking up the overall theme of the forum, which is post-pandemic global democracy on impact, challenges, and opportunities. So this is a very necessary conversation to have, especially in the current scenario we're in, particularly in the context of migration. We've seen a lot of challenges, the exploitation, abuse that migrants go through, that have been worsened and exacerbated. And seeing the impact of the pandemic, they've been pushed to the front in terms of vulnerabilities, and they are among the ones who become most marginalized, and yet we see that they are at the back of the line in terms of COVID response. We see that they confront extreme challenges in accessing healthcare, safety mechanisms for their basic survival, accessing justice, and in addition to that, they also become subject to more inequality, discrimination, and even stigma that arise in the middle of the pandemic, and in relation to COVID-19. So this whole scenario really brings the need and urgency for us to rethink the idea of both democracy and human rights in the context of migration. The idea of democracy rooted in principles of social inclusion, of participation, and of empowerment of migrants. And it's something that we now see that we need to revisit the ways, our ways pre-pandemic in normal times, and reassess how these issues around migration, around migrants and migrant workers are addressed, and how we push forward our advocacy for migrants, especially taking into account like the SDGs, particularly in SDG 16 plus, under the principle of no one left behind. So really there becomes the need to refocus and look at the bigger picture of human rights and democracy, and rethink how can migrants be included and allowed to participate in various ways and be more empowered, and included in countries of destination, more included in societies of countries of destination, like allowing them to join unions, allowing them to organize, to take on leadership positions, policy lobbying, and the like. So let's go right into the discussion. I'm pleased to have four of our speakers, four exceptional speakers on our panel. And I will introduce them one by one as they start on their intervention. And we will start with Mr. BINOD KHADRIA, who is a former professor of economics, education and international migration, and chairperson of the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, School of Social Sciences of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. He has had 3 decades of teaching, research and publication on migration, diaspora, and transnationalism, and was the director of International Migration and Diaspora Studies Project. He in 2017 to 2018, he held the inaugural Indian Council for Cultural Relations Chair on Contemporary Indian Migration and Diaspora at Rutgers University in the USA, and was a key commentator in the processes that led to the UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration in 2018. Currently, he's on editorial boards of several peer-reviewed journals, advisory boards of a number of international organizations and think tanks, including the International Steering Committee of Metropolis International International, co-convener of Metropolis Asia, and a member of the IOM's Migration Research Leader Syndicate. So to start off with the discussion, maybe to kick off with a more broad take on the topic. I'd like to pose to you a question in a post-COVID world, in the perspective of a post-pandemic world. What, according to you, would take like a broad framing of inclusive democracy to establish the human rights of migrant workers in countries of the nation, particularly in the post-COVID context? So I'll hand over the floor to you. And just to note as well, for the speakers, you will have 7 to 10 minutes for your intervention, but of course you will be allotted some time to answer follow-up questions or questions from the floor if there are any. And to the participants, please feel free to note down your inputs or any questions to the speakers in the chat. Over to you, BINOD.
Thank you, Ayessa, for that very kind introduction. I'm of course grateful to MFA, particularly to William Goy for inviting me, and Ayessa Nilong for remaining connected throughout with all the updates of the event. So in addressing the issues involved in the broad framing of inclusive democracy, so as to establish the human rights of migrant workers in their destination countries or destinations within the country, I would like us to put our minds together and rethink a number of basic questions. Although these questions may have been simmering in our minds for long, they require a fresh look in a post-COVID world perspective. I would like to deconstruct these questions for their meanings in the new complexities of a post-COVID world. Now, the first question, basic question, I would like you all to rethink is, what is democracy? Because the title of this session is Migration and Inclusive Democracy. So we may begin by understanding what is democracy. And the most popular, well-known, comprehensive answer that most of us have learned and memorized since our school or college days is the one given by Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th president of the US from 1861 to 1865. By the way, he also abolished the slavery. So that was more than 50 years before the Spanish flu pandemic, the one prior to the COVID-19 that had struck the world a century ago. The 16th president, as I said, one of the world's president of the USA, the world's largest democracy, one of the largest democracies. I come from another large democracy, India. He had said, in terms of what a democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We have dwelt a lot on three words: by, of, and for. But who are these people that he is talking about? The question that remains unanswered is, who are these people? Are they only citizens, or they also include migrants? If also migrants, then only immigrants or also emigrants, migrants who live in countries other than their own. Whereas government of the people includes only resident citizens, and by the people includes mainly the residents, because we have seen that postal ballots are often not considered, and it created a row in the United States very recently, as we saw, created by the 45th president and his supporters very recently. So that is what happens, whether the postal ballots, those who are citizens of a country but staying outside the domain, can take part in democratic selection or not. But it is for the people. The democracy is for the people. The government is for the people, which includes immigrants as well. whether regular or irregular, both workers and their families, and also emigrant citizens who have been living abroad. This is because sovereign democratic states are supposed to protect the individual human rights of people, including migrant workers. Now, this is the principle which defines inclusive democracy that we are supposed to address here from the perspective of migrants and their human rights in the COVID and post-COVID times. So that answers my basic question number 2 in terms of what is inclusive democracy. To my mind, any discourse on inclusive democracy, however, begs a counter question as to whether there is an exclusive democracy as opposed to inclusive democracy, and with policies and practices that excludes the migrants and their human rights. My answer to this would be yes, there are ample examples of majoritarian principles of democracy being applied for negative and regressive decisions against the legitimate interests of particular sets of people like migrants and other minorities. And these examples, to just mention a few of them, very recent ones, we have the Brexit resolution, which was apparently democratically passed to exclude the EU migrants from England. Similarly, Mexico wall, the US travel ban on migrants from 7 Islamic countries, the Scotland referendum, which is a democratic tool, referendum is a democratic tool to sever from the United Kingdom, the Catalonia referendum in Spain, the Australian mandate to exclude the boat people from the mainland, the National Register of Citizens in Assam in India to exclude the Bangladeshis through IMDT Act of 1983, forced upon the government by people's movement and mandated by democratic institutions like the Parliament and the Supreme Court at enormous human cost. Last but not the least, the Indian state excluding internal migrants, workers from other Indian states from travel across internal borders or depriving them of basic human rights that Ayessa had just mentioned in terms of access to food, shelter, justice, medication during the COVID-triggered lockdown last year. So that my next question is what comprises human rights and what are the democratic means to establish or reinstate them for the migrants. You all know that human rights are individual rights to life and liberty, freedom of assembly, speech, equality, minority rights, and so on, to fully participate in their social, economic, cultural, and religious practices. These are democratic rights which are not limited to voting rights in elections through universal adult franchise. You also know that there are democratic tools of making collective and social choice, like the simple majority of more than 50% votes, supermajority of 2/3 or 3/4 votes on crucial issues, and even consensus, 100% votes to uphold human rights of even the minority of one single person. All these serve crucial purposes of inclusiveness, but if and when inappropriately applied, they can lead to exclusion of migrants. For example, as crucial a decision as Brexit was passed by just about 51–52% of the votes, but how many adult voters turned out to vote? 70%. Other 30% didn't. So if we multiply 50% or 51% by 70%, then that turns out to be only 36%. The remaining 64% of the judges, the public judges, did not pass it, and it was still through. That is the irony, that is the dilemma that it throws before us. So my next or fifth question, who is a migrant? The outsider, the alien, the stranger at the gate, as they are often called derogatively. Often we have seen the so-called sons of the soil parochial movements that Myron Weiner talked about, raising its ugly head of hate speech, attacks, looting, rape, and killing etc. of the other, whether citizens inside a country, like, for example, in my country, often in Maharashtra, sometimes in Assam, or foreigners from outside, like in Australia against the Indian students a few years ago. These are gross violations of human rights pertaining to different language and culture, food habits, civic behavior, and so on. Now, as per the UN multilateral protocol, an international migrant is one who resides in a country other than one's own birth for more than a year. An internal migrant in Indian census is one born or residing in a place other than that or at enumeration. I find these definitions too mechanical and short-sighted from the point of migrant identity formation. I believe a dynamic identity of a migrant based on lineage needs to be traced back several generations to its origin in the past and track several generations into the future. Who then in the population have a migrant origin? India's OCI, Overseas Citizenship of India, imparts the identity person of Indian origin on a foreigner having links up to 3 generations backwards with a parent, a grandparent, or a great-grandparent, Indian citizen. I would vouch, and I have written elsewhere, that similar entitlements be offered to 3 future generations of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren with access to human rights as migrants in whichever geographical space one is residing or going, whichever border one crosses, another country, another state, within a country, another district, block, or municipal town or village panchayat. This brings me to the next question about the very core of inclusion or inclusive democracy, the multilateral, the multi-level federalism, bestowing the rights of representation as electors and electees to migrant workers and families in the geographical or administrative units. This needs to follow a bottom-up approach from a municipal election to state election to national election, and above all, at multilateral negotiations across borders. There are multiple dimensions to such inclusiveness. My colleague speakers would address some of these, like gender, like labor rights, like empowerment of migrants. We will listen to them, but we still have a long way to go. But if nobody joins us in our march, let's walk alone. As Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate Indian poet, famous poem is well known, walk alone, walk alone. So no one should be left behind. That is the SGD tells us, the GCM tells us, and that would be the true mark of our solidarity with the spirit of the 18th May Gwangju democratic movement that took place 41 years ago on 18th May. We are proud to be part of this through this parallel session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bino. That was a great kickoff to our discussion, and you've certainly given a lot of points to reflect on in terms of democracy from across the globe and how we are situated in it. From the get-go, it is imperative, as you said, to consider who comprises the democracy, and this is something that we strongly need to consider in framing our perspective in building a post-COVID plan, especially as you raised, there are, contrary to an inclusive democracy, there are many systems that are actually non-inclusive and very exclusive, that are inequitable and heavily embedded in the systems of nations across the globe where migrants reside, and where they continue to be perceived as non-citizens, treated as outsiders and alienated from mainstream society. And you've given us some really concrete examples. And as you said, our other speakers will elaborate, and we're actually going to dive into the various contexts that make up the bigger picture of how migrant workers and migrants in general are situated in the democratic landscape, particularly in countries of destination. So I will come back to you later and let you reflect as well on the points of the other speakers that they will be raising, and ask you on what would be the critical points of action that need to be strongly considered as we look forward in building a post-COVID plan that's, as you said, more inclusive and that which empowers migrant workers and migrants in general. So I'll let you reflect on that question as well. And I will move on to our second speaker, Ms. Ellen Sana, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Migrant Advocacy in the Philippines, which is a non-government organization that works for the rights and welfare of Filipino migrant workers and their families through policy advocacy and facilitating assistance to distressed migrants, capacity building, networking, research, education, and information work. Ms. Ellen's work includes advocacy and lobby work at local, national, regional, and international forums, training and capacity building on migrants' rights, and she also serves as CMA's principal resource person and representative on migration-related forums and activities in the Philippines and abroad. So Ms. Ellen, just to picking up from the intervention of BINOD, he did mention as well that this is also definitely a very gendered discussion. I would like to pose to you the question, how are women migrant workers, in terms of women migrant workers, how are they excluded from participation in democratic processes in destination countries? And I'll start off with that question. Perhaps he will pick up from there. And I'll hand over the floor to you. And again, you will have 7 to 10 minutes for your intervention.
Okay. Thank you, Ayessa, and solidarity greetings to everyone. Thank you to Professor BINOD for doing the broad framework of the topic on democracy and as this relates to our migrant workers and their human rights and labor rights. But first off, let me also thank our friends from Korea for providing an avenue for non-Koreans to also take part in discussions on very important issues such as democracy and the rights of migrant workers. So thank you for the solidarity. So for my first round of intervention, let me read my prepared notes. Okay. So my assignment is on the gender dimension of the issue. So let me start off by revisiting how many and who are the women migrants that we're talking about. So based on the latest statistics, that would be like 2019, women migrants comprise almost half of all international migrants. So if it's half, then that would be about 136 million. Out of these, 66.6 million are women migrant workers. And out of this 66.6 million, 8.5 million are women migrant domestic workers, a lot of whom are in our very own region in Asia Pacific. Women migrant workers are mostly employed in the care economy because of the gendered division of labor. Nonetheless, the contribution in terms of remittances to help their families and their country of origin and the services extended in the countries of destination cannot be overemphasized. However, they receive the lowest of wages, even if on occasions there is clear mismatch in terms of their skills and qualifications and the actual work they do. Specifically for care workers and domestic workers who are mostly women, their work is of enormous importance as it ensures the household members to go about their own lives and work smoothly and happily, I would say. What is more, these migrant domestic workers and care workers bail out the governments of the countries of destination of their duties to provide welfare services for their population who are in need of care, such as the children, the elderly, and the people with disabilities. Specifically, during public health crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, but also wars and conflicts, many households in the countries of destination would attest to the indispensability of the migrant care providers. They are the frontliners and the essential workers. Unfortunately, the accolades do not translate much to the recognition of the rights of these migrant workers, whether you're talking of SDG 8.5 or SDG 8.6, no? They continue to experience acute deficits in their rights as women, one, but also as migrants, as BINOD was saying, and also because they're concentrated in the so-called low-skilled occupations with the lowest of wages. And this is manifested in the following, just to give you some examples. Number one, right to form or join workers' organizations or associations. Women migrant domestic workers are discouraged from joining or forming associations of their own. One explanation by a trade union leader in one country of destination is that this may prove burdensome to them because they have to pay membership dues and deduct this from their already very low salaries. The trade union instead simply develop programs and services for migrant domestic workers. In several instances, the right to form or join trade unions is even on the basis of reciprocity between countries of origin and destination. Number two, rights at work and social protection. As you may know, despite ILO Convention 189 declaring domestic work as work, legally, many countries have yet to include them in the ambit of protection of the labor and social laws. This manifested in many instances, duty bearers, both origin and destination countries, will argue that this takes a while, the inclusion of domestic workers in the ambit of protection because of the peculiar situation of domestic workers. Number two, this excuse extends, in fact, to labor inspection, wherein, again, both origin and destination country will argue against the applicability of the labor inspections, citing privacy of the households. Like there's nothing we can do about this. Also, wage gap based on the ILO study of December 2020, on the average in high-income countries, migrant workers receive 12.9% less wages than national workers, with variance of 42.1% depending on the sector that the migrants are working in, and as high as 71% less reduction for low-skilled workers. And for migrant care workers, most of whom are women, the pay gap is 19.6% with national care workers. This is higher than the average of 12.6, as I mentioned earlier. Expressed differently, where there is legislated minimum wage applied, the exception will be migrant domestic workers who will have to contend with what is called the minimum allowable wage, which is lower than the minimum statutory wage. This defies the reason for being for declaring a floor level, which is for the workers and his or her family to get by. Another point is as regards social protection. Again, some countries of destination will argue against it being mandatory because the workers' share in social security contribution will further reduce the take-home salary of the workers. Number three, disqualification from residency status. Some countries of destination declare migrant domestic workers ineligible to residency for foreign workers, again arguing that they are just temporary workers who are expected to return to their countries of origin. But the provision actually applies to all other foreign workers except the migrant domestic workers. Number four, another exclusion, right to family reunification in the country of destination. While the countries of destination are silent about this, women migrants find it more difficult to bring their family members to the CODs because eligibility is dependent on the income of the migrant workers. In the case of live-in domestic workers, this will prove almost impossible as they themselves oftentimes do not have enough physical spaces for themselves. Another manifestation of exclusion is the mandatory pregnancy test for women migrants. Some countries of destination still practice mandatory pregnancy tests and is used as ground for termination of the employment contract and deportation. So you are being penalized for being a woman, because of course the men do not get pregnant. Number 6, the right to participate in public activities and or being consulted on policies that affect the migrant sector. This is denied in many instances for migrant workers and more so for women migrants who have more limited mobility, time off from their work, and other restrictions that make them unable to join or participate. Another issue is the right to vote, to have a say in the selection of government officials. A few countries have extended voting rights to their citizens abroad. A few countries of destination at the local level have extended voting rights as well to migrant workers, but we are still a long way for its effective exercise. Another is access to basic service on site. Again, more women migrants are unable to do this, whether online or face-to-face, because of more restrictions imposed on them, and not to mention access to connectivity. And of course, finally, these exclusionary laws and practices are not only found in countries of destination, but origin countries as well are equally guilty of it when women workers are not able to join the labor force in the origin country because they are expected to attend to the unpaid care work in the household brought about by the unequal distribution of household work among the members of the household. When migrants experience abuse in destination countries, the immediate recourse of countries of origin is to declare a deployment ban. And this is the case of domestic workers who are most vulnerable to abuse and exploitation because of the nature of their job. For sure, states are duty bound to protect, but in this case, it has been proven by evidence that deployment bans are not effective unless decent job opportunities for women workers are made available in the origin countries, that there are actually ways to improve their working and living conditions in the destination country by extending efforts to negotiate, to advocate with the destination countries, and to eventually by consulting migrants themselves to find out what works best for them in this situation. So these are some examples of how democratic principles and practices in the destination and origin countries have excluded migrant workers, more specifically women migrant workers. In the case of the latter, the issue is more than just at the level of being foreigners or aliens, but also because they are women and are in low-wage occupation bordering on informality and precarity. And then it goes around. So it's like a chicken and egg thing. Sometimes this is how they are looking at it. On the side of the duty bearers, it is a notable observation that where protection for women migrants is concerned, they act like they know better than the migrants themselves, who are perceived to be incapable of protecting themselves. Duty bearers forget the acts of running away from their employers, the act of deciding to migrate even if they do not know much what awaits them in the destination country, the act of juggling their time between their jobs and worrying about their young children back home are all acts of bravery. That's the other way to look at it. And in fact, in exercising their agency as women. So maybe at this point, I will stop. And the second round, which is like, have there been changes in all of these observations, I will try to articulate in the next round of interventions. So thank you, Ayessa. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ellen. And that was a really great intervention. We see that in the case of women migrant workers, while there is some recognition of them providing value to the economy in state building to both country of destination and country of origin, their right to participate or be like part of the main societies of countries of destination, it's really not, according to the examples you cited, it's really not reflected in the general migration governance around women migrant workers, especially those in care work, as you cited, in domestic work. And we can see that the existing barriers are totally really put are against the odds for women migrants. Their exclusion is seen in multiple dimensions. They're excluded as workers. They're excluded as women, as such that we can see that they're totally singled out in terms of the migration processes that they have to go through. And it's like with the other policies that you mentioned, their participation in the country of destination is almost like a separate discussion from the main conversations that are being had on migrants' rights, which shouldn't be the case, of course. And more often than not, it becomes almost a non-negotiable discussion, not up for discussion, as you have cited, for example, in the case of labor inspections. And so I guess a question that I would ask for you in the next round of intervention is, what would be if you could elaborate more on the shortcomings of policymakers and institutions, both in the country of destination and origin, that really contribute to the lack of the voice and agency that we're seeing among women migrant workers and even migrant workers in general, like in the gaps that there are in terms of the existing mechanisms and policies that broadly enable the larger non-inclusion and disempowerment of workers, especially in the current context of COVID. So from that, I'll move on in the meantime to our next speaker, Ms. Ishwari Das. She is a research associate and a policy analyst at Migrant Forum in Asia since 2017, and she is currently based in India. And her published work was focused upon undocumented migrants in the ASEAN, as well as the Comprehensive Information and Orientation Program, or CIOP, for the International Organization for Migration, or the IOM. And she also earlier worked with the Center for Indian Migrant Studies based in Kerala. So thank you, Ishwari, for joining us at the last minute. And I guess to start off your intervention, I would like to raise the question, because we are seeing this non-inclusivity in democratic processes at a global level, but in particular, how do democratic practices how would democratic practices ensure that human rights are guaranteed and warranted, particularly in non-democratic regions such as in the Gulf? So I'll hand over the floor to you for your intervention, Ishwari.
Okay, thank you. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ishwari Das. I'm here replacing my colleague Akhil, who's unfortunately unwell. So I hope I can do him some justice. By and large, let me just get down to it. By and large, my intervention will be focusing on the democratic context with respect to labor rights and well, a little bit of the Gulf region, but by and large, how labor rights function within this democratic context. So for migrant workers, by and large, we see that the human rights of migrant workers, it's reduced to a contract. And the contract is what determines, let's say, the breadth and the scope of the human rights that they can access in the country of destination. This contract is, again, how democratic is the process of this contract? First of all, this contract is not negotiated between the employer and the migrant, which in a usual sense, in a usual employment strategy would be employed. So the contract is not negotiated between the migrant and the employer. It is only offered to the migrant. And the migrant, of course, has the choice to say yes or no, but there is nothing to, let's say, negotiate within that space, within the contract that is being offered to him. Another issue is, of course, struggle to access grievance redressal and access to justice in countries of destination. And it becomes even more severe if they're irregular, if they're low skill, and as Ms. Ellen mentioned, domestic workers as well. So there are several layers of vulnerability that function even within this one point. Second, it's basically migrant workers, they leave a system, they leave their country of origin that already exists for them, where it might be easier to access grievance redressal. It's easier to get social support. They basically give up on the system for let's say, for economic interests, and they end up in the system which concerns two or more state machineries, which is like the country of destination government, country of origin government, as well as the societies. So you have state machineries, you have the societies, and this one migrant worker has to basically navigate between or maneuver between these systems. And what we see is that all of these systems fail to take responsibility in assuring migrants' rights and protecting them from vulnerabilities. And this we clearly saw, because this we clearly saw during the COVID. Until then, there were obviously, let's say, proclamations and impressions that either side is working on it. But in COVID, we really saw their vulnerabilities. We really saw how neither government, neither state, neither society was able to ensure migrants their rights. So that is second. Third, I'd just like to, let's say, how will a migrant worker access their human rights in a non-democratic setting? So I'll just like to maybe break down this question into three, right? So the first is basically how the worker is able to communicate with the state. That is the communication or the voice, that a migrant worker can use, and how that, how communication and voice function as in a democracy and as a democratic practice, right? The voice of the person. So first question is how the migrant worker, how far or how much is the migrant worker able to communicate with the state? Second, how the worker is included in both country of origin and country of destination as a target group in policy making decisions or as a social group, as Ms. Ellen had previously mentioned as well. And third, of course, how the worker is able to participate in their own empowerment and how they're able to represent themselves. And that is, of course, with respect to freedom of association and right to overseas voting. I don't mean to club them all together, but these are some three questions when we look at it. How a migrant worker is able to access their human rights, their labor rights in a non-democratic setting, in a democratic setting. This is how I think, personally, how we can analyze the situation when we ask these three questions. Fourth, okay, so now let's just going into some basic issues that we see when we look at how a migrant worker's human rights are affected in a non-democratic setting. First of all, the accessibility to information for migrant workers is affected via language because of the supporting infrastructure, such as, let's say, ICT facilities that's available around them, accessing internet and so on. And of course, lack of grassroots level efforts by the state. This is something that, again, that we saw during the COVID situation. Secondly, during the pandemics, measures of desegregation were kind of intensified because we saw that as the pandemic, or let's say the first phase of the pandemic, as it spread, the first areas that were declared containment zones were migrant worker accommodations and residential areas, right? And this, they were desegregated because it was, let's say, erroneously believed, right, that these measures would restrict the spread. And this was further, let's say, justified, and this is, let's say, pushed forward by more xenophobic notions prevalent within society and perceptions that was put forward by the media. So this was observed in several Gulf states and prominently Malaysia as well, where migrant workers' residences were targeted and they were raided in what public officials called efforts to contain the spread. And this was, as you can imagine, it only caused quite a controversy there. Migrant experiences, negotiating spaces. That's something that we may need to highlight, because how far are they able to access public spaces? In countries of destination, this is in fact quite limited, and their own personal spaces, migrant workers' personal spaces, are relegated to these peripherals of the city, or I'm talking, let's say, spatially, right? And this also denotes this inherent dehumanization by the state actors and employers. It may seem like a strong statement, but of course, with respect to, let's say, labor camps, with respect to industrial areas, they're placed at the peripherals of a city. And this is something that we may need to look at when we look at how far a migrant worker is, how democratic the society is really for migrant workers, how it functions for migrant workers. Now, next, when we look at it, so because another issue that migrant workers face with respect to, let's say, spaces, with respect to accessing or the opportunity to voice or representation and so on, there are, let's say, visible and invisible conditions of exclusion, of segregation. Migrant workers are, again, voices are represented by by state and non-state actors like civil society and missions and academia and international organizations and all these other actors. So again, we need to also look at whether our spaces are democratic as well, right? Whether these voices that are being represented, whether the migrant voices that are in fact being represented in these spaces, if they're appropriately represented responsibly and if they're effectively represented. So this is something that we may also need to look at when we're looking at, let's say, if this is not the case, whether migrant workers will be able to represent themselves at all in the future. Now, when we go into a post-COVID society, maybe something that we may really need to look at is this. Finally, just to quickly sum up, the manner in which the migrant is identified and his residence or existence in the country of destination is validated, it becomes a precursor to to the rights that he enjoys, right? So for example, it really depends on the visa you come on and the work permit that you have. With respect to the rights that you can access in the country of destination. So if you are, let's say, a certain visa category, you're a higher skilled, and therefore you fall under a certain visa category, the rights that you are able to enjoy are far more than ones that are not. Now, what this happens by and large, it really restricts the migrant worker. And once the migrant worker's documentation, let's say it has expired, this very documentation, which really determines their experience, their migration experience. Once this documentation is expired, or if their work contracts were broken down, they become, again, they are given another identity. This is something that Ms. Ellen had mentioned as well. They become illegal, they become criminal, they become squatters, they become all these unsavory, let's say, these terms that are being applied to them, undocumented and so on. And basically these terms are applied to maybe also to, and it gives out this impression that the migrant doesn't deserve these certain rights and they should accept these deprivation of their rights because they are undocumented or illegal or criminal or squatters and so on. So this is something, and this is further justified by state actions, right? Because they didn't follow, let's say, instruments of state action or state authority, and they look to, let's say, assert freedoms otherwise. So I'll go into that maybe in the second round or so, but this is something that we may need to look at. So by and large, let's say the bottom line of what I'm really getting to, for the migrant worker, their world of work is pretty much it. How their occupation determines their entire migration experience, how they come into that job, how they live there, everything it's always with respect to their identity as an economic migrant. So during the pandemic and in general, we understand that simply being a migrant worker, being employed in the country of destination and contributing to both economies of your country of origin and country of destination, these societies, it's no guarantee for your well-being, for your stability, for your security. It doesn't matter if you really are all of these things, right? So when we place, what happens by and large in countries of destination is that we place the agency and the rights of a migrant, a worker, or a human, basically, with another institution or another person in a non-democratic setting, outside of the migrant's context, then there is no guarantee that they will obtain these rights or be able to demonstrate their agency. So that's the bottom line. I'm done. Maybe second round we can come back to it. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Ishri, and that was really a great intervention. I really like how you set migrant rights and democracy in the context of labor migration, how they're reduced to a contract, and how their labor environment really determines how they're able to participate in the country of destination. And this is, it really contributes to how they're primarily treated as temporary in terms of the contract, and how they're, in some contexts, how they're tied to employers. And so it really, you see that it reduces like the policies and mechanisms that are available for them, which will it reduces how they can benefit from the available policies in the long term. For, as you know, there are a lot of migrants who are not temporary as they are treated. Many of them reside in the country of destinations for more than 7 years or so. And really we see that the scope of human rights is in the context that they're in, as you said, in the world of work. And you really highlighted an important point in terms of opening up spaces in the countries of destination for self-empowerment and representing themselves and having them directly involved in these processes, in legislative processes, prioritizing the voice of workers and giving them a key role in formulating policies that directly impact them. So allowing them to join unions and such. And I guess we can also, of course, you can elaborate more on the second round of discussion, but just also a question similar to the one I posed to BINOD. We are seeing a lot of new reforms in the Gulf context, a lot of policy reforms and legislation in the context of the Gulf. And how would, similar to the question I posed, how do you see this playing a role in the post-COVID context, in the post-COVID plan, and looking forward, how will this shape kind of the democratic landscape for migrant workers with respect to the reforms that's out there in the context of the Gulf? So thank you so much, Ishri, and you can of course reflect on that in the meantime, and we will move to our last, fourth, and of course last but not least speaker, MISUN Kim. MISUN is the executive director of the Migrant Health Association in Korea, We Friends, and she's also a member of the Joint Committee with Migrants in Korea, or JCMK, where she was previously the organization's steering committee chairperson in 2018 and chairperson of the executive committee in 2004. She graduated with a major in history in Korea University for her undergraduate degree and a master's degree in international studies at the same university. She was also the chairperson of the Foreign Resident Committee of the Welfare Governance of Seoul and a member of the Freedom Rights Second Special Committee of the National Human Rights Commission of Korea at present. So, Misun, I understand in Korea, especially at the height of the pandemic, at the onset of the pandemic early in 2020, your organization has done a lot of mobilization around pushing for anti-discrimination that arose during the pandemic. And from the perspective of working in a country of destination, how did the COVID-19 pandemic, how were migrants left behind, especially in the country of destination? What are the systemic barriers that makes the society of the country of destination not inclusive and participatory during the time of COVID? So I'll start off with that question and I'll hand over the floor to you, Misun.
Good afternoon from Seoul. Thank you for organizer MFA and having me this meaningful session, especially as a part of Gwangju Democratic Forum this year. And as you said, because of COVID-19, everyone has affected by that pandemic, and it has changed people's daily lives and has caused the social systems to be re-examined. So in particular, it was made to reflect on how the existing social system works for non-nationals, as migrants, as minorities in society who are more vulnerable during crisis. So ironically, the outbreak of COVID-19 caused a global crisis, but at the same time, it became an opportunity for us to see how the principle of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that leaves no one behind is actually being implemented. With the COVID-19 pandemic, migrants who have sustained our society suddenly became nobody, as if they were not being seen or have never existed. Therefore, COVID-19 pandemic challenging us to review the social system that did not function properly or lacked during the crisis. First of all, racial discrimination and xenophobia were the first phenomena that appeared in relation to the outbreak of COVID-19 in many countries of destination in Asia, I believe, which also affected the operation of the existing social system. Due to the name of the COVID-19 as Wuhan virus in the early stage of pandemic, xenophobia and discrimination against Chinese migrants continued, while migrant workers experienced the sudden dismissal, unpaid wages, and exclusion from the social support system. For example, exclusion of migrants are experienced by many ways and areas, from purchasing or distribution of facial masks, access to personal protective gears, emergency relief funds, and difficulties in social distancing due to overcrowded dormitory for migrant workers, and to safe return home due to lack of flight, etc. Especially access to healthcare services were also excluded as public medical institutions transformed to the COVID-19 response system. Free health services and vaccinations, especially for which were available undocumented migrants and children before, were suspended and had to pay for it to visit other medical institutions, which caused financial problems for them. And all of these problems prove that the existing social system is not inclusive of migrants and other non-nationals in times of disaster and crisis. Migrant workers are permitted to stay on the basis of a labor contract, as Easwari said, and receive social services accordingly. But in the COVID-19 pandemic, the grounds for stay is denied by sudden dismissal. In addition, even when leaving Korea is difficult, access to all social services is also difficult. In Korea, for example, many workers were unable to return because of the lack of flights, although they obtained a plane ticket to return to their home country due to visa expiration or job loss. In this case, a temporary period of stay is given, but during this period, no social services are available. In the end, the access to economic activities and health services that most necessary for survival of migrants is excluded in situations where they cannot even leave the country. This is because the principle of inclusion to support for migrants during disasters and crisis has never been properly tested. And in particular, it clearly shows that the health system is operated only for its own nationals and citizens. In addition, even if migrants in the country of destination are not guaranteed the same rights as their nationals, the status of residence is recognized locally, but even such a system did not function properly during disasters. For example, again in Korea, recognizes foreigners as foreign residents who residing in the local jurisdiction for more than 3 months, and allows them to use property and public facilities of the local government on the same basis as residents and receive various administrative benefits from the local government. However, in the case of emergency relief funds, migrants were not recognized as foreign residents, but only as foreigners by applying the system different ways. So this is what prepares for the first question.
Thank you so much for that, MISUN. And you really described very clearly the situation migrants were in, especially at the height of the pandemic, where we see that the existing systems were really failing, and it really reveals how we've been falling behind all this time during normal times pre-pandemic, and how there's really a need to ramp up the current systems in terms of social protection and in terms of health, access to healthcare, access to justice, and how these were all really were not totally not available for migrant workers. And you have also illustrated how the current protocols were difficult in the case of migrant workers, especially because they are placed in a unique context for migrant workers in countries of destination. As you cited, there's a difficulty in following protocols such as social distancing, where because there are overcrowded dorms, and this is of course not the case for citizens in the mainstream society. And so it really shows that there was a lack of urgency in focusing on the needs of migrant workers and treating them more urgently, as identifying that their experiences are unique and that there are different mechanisms and measures that need to be taken in their case. And yet we are seeing only that there continues to be further inequality in their case. As you said, she cited a lot of cases of xenophobia and racism, which only adds to the challenges that they experienced during the pandemic. And I guess as posing for the next question, what would you think needs to be done, can be done post-COVID in order to achieve an inclusive democratic society, or if you can also look into areas, specific areas that need to be considered, like in the other examples that you cited in your first intervention. It would be great for you to elaborate on that. And I guess before we move on to, it would depend on the speakers, but we are seeing some questions from in the chat box. If you would want to address that first, I guess I'll go to BINOD. There's a question in the chat box in terms of, and I'll read it out for you. If you would like to start off, BINOD, on the question in the chat box. India has given substantive opportunities for Indians, focusing largely on economic opportunity. What prevents it from going in the political sphere? If you would like to respond to the question, or would you need some time to reflect on it?
I will. Yeah. Well, very important policy question, and that has been dogging the Indian government for quite some time. And this is rightly pointed out that the non-resident Indians, persons of Indian origin, and those who are holders of overseas citizenship of India, they do enjoy a number of rights in India, like OCI is equivalent to lifetime visa. NRIs get, differential interest rates on their deposits in India, the remittances and capital investment. So, and of course, they have the right to access education in India, or health services, or land, excepting for land rights in plantation areas. And, they don't have the right to take part in the elections from a distance, and not to stand in elections for public positions. So I think what is, why this has not materialized, I think there is a lot of politics behind it. First of all, the non-resident Indians who are still Indian citizens are entitled to take part as in representation, either as voters first, and perhaps not so early to stand in elections when they are not present in the country. I think they are looked at as vote banks abroad, and are likely to be maneuvered by the Indian, political powers in the Indian political corridors, that forces that operate. So that, I think, is basically the reason. And we have recently seen, even as I mentioned in my presentation, so was the case in counting the ballots, the postal ballots in the American election, presidential election. It was being claimed that they are fake votes and so on. So I think these are some of the considerations where it may become a challenge for the Indian electorate to accept the representation of the emigrants from India who are still Indian citizens. So that, I think, is the basic thing. And I would also say that there are many wheels within wheels in the Indian politics. For example, when I was listening to the presentation on gender, the one bill that has been lying for maybe 20 years in the Indian Parliament and the assemblies is the women's representation bill. There is a special quota or positive discrimination, reservation in the public representation by the women. Why that has not gone ahead? That is not specifically to NRIs, but also resident Indian women. So that is where the Indian culture and the Indian society comes into play, whether that would be backseat driving by the male counterparts in the families, the fathers, the husbands, the brothers, the sons, and so on. So these are considerations. But what was debated there was the reservation policy itself, whether within the reserved quotas for the women, there should be the other constitutional reservations for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, and so on. So I think these are again the considerations which are also touching upon NRI representation in Indian electorate.
Thank you so much, Binod. And sorry, I had to turn off my camera momentarily. My internet's getting a bit weak, but I see there are more questions being posted in the chat. I think we can go to Miss Ellen if you want to respond. To Ishwari, if you want to respond to the question in the chat box from William. In countries where democracy as we see it maybe be wanting to, how would you see participation, representation and inclusion, and if you can cite examples where this is happening.
Who gets to speak first? Is it me or is it Ezra?
The questions posed Ishwari, but if you would like to step in, Miss Ellen, that would be fine.
Maybe
so Ishwari can reflect on the question.
No, I think the questions for Eswari, so you go ahead. I'll answer the one posted by William on the gender aspect later after Eswari. Thanks.
All right. I see it above. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. You can go after Ishwari, Miss Ellen. Sorry, I missed the question above. Go ahead, Ishwari.
Okay. So I had messaged William because I wasn't exactly sure like whether he was talking about democratic countries or non-democratic countries. Okay, so let's say now with respect to if we're talking about, I'm still unsure of what the question means. Can he clarify the question for me, please?
Yes, maybe William can clarify in the chat, but in the meantime, so we can ask, in the meantime, I'll ask Ms. Ellen to respond first to the question posed to her by William. So,
okay, yeah.
Give it some thought.
Okay, so let me just briefly respond to William, and probably also make reference to the concern or comment of Alex on, of course, within the nation state, people of different stratum also struggle to be part of this inclusive democracy. So it becomes really more challenging for non-citizens to assert that inclusion to be applied to them as well. But I think at the end of the day, it's actually the hashtag that we want to really promote in terms of asserting the spaces for the migrants is pushback. You just have to keep on pushing back. Because, of course, this phenomenon of labor migration, when people started crossing borders in big numbers, probably are not imaginable, are not really like that acceptable to nation states, because this is not the time anymore for wars and occupations. And I don't know if they are still in that time zone where they would see aliens and foreigners as invaders and occupiers. And I don't think that is the case. And I think they know that, but it becomes an excuse for them not to be able to do something about the situation. And again, our argument, we want to always use this in the migrant rights advocacy, nothing is cast on stone. So if the laws do not work anymore to accommodate the minority quote unquote people, then by all means, they deserve to be changed. And of course, it will not come on a silver platter. You just have to push back. And this is what's happening, for example, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Macau, in Taiwan, where migrants started to organize. You know, the migrant domestic workers, these women who have very, very little time for themselves because they are 24/7 working in the households. But you have the domestic workers union in Hong Kong and in other countries. You have the International Domestic Workers Federation. You have trade unions in origin countries and destinations recognizing and supporting these groups, which were probably not imaginable many years ago. We are now seeing countries coming together. You have the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, Colombo process, trying to work out solutions. Because the thing is, this is not like a whim for people crossing the borders. A lot of these migrant workers cross legally because they are admitted in the country of destination. So I think this, at the end of the day, this is just the message that we wanted to say to the, you know, out there, you know, that things have changed. It's very interesting. I've been reflecting. 189 it took the ILO 100 years before they recognized that domestic work is work. And just yesterday, I was telling Ayessa that the Philippine government is still in the process of ratifying Convention 81 of the ILO on labor inspection, which is 1947. It's a 74-year-old law, convention on labor inspection, and it is not even, they cannot imagine it being applied to the situation of migrant domestic workers. So that is how difficult it is. But I think what we are saying here as advocates is that things need to be changed. And I think this is what we're trying to do, and by putting on the spotlight the most vulnerable among them, and that would include women migrant workers. Countries, the duty bearers have this notion of like, okay, care work is a reproductive work, and there is very low regard and valuation for these types of work. And this is always, of course, related directly to women, that this is women's work. And I think this is about time that we challenge this. You see how important they are, particularly in Asia. In Singapore, Alex, right? 1 in 5 of households need a caregiver. And these caregivers are usually migrant caregivers. They cannot do without these caregivers. But then we have to put it there that, well, you have to take care of us, not by giving extra privileges or special treatment, but just extending them decent work conditions. So I think that is what is needed. And especially the women, get them to hear out what they have to say. In the case of the union in Hong Kong, it's not enough that they are recognized to form their unions, because if they are working 24/7, they cannot participate in the activities of the union. And so they are able to negotiate that when they need to do union duties, they should be allowed by their employers. So this is what I'm saying as well, that in addressing concerns of women migrants, we have to be very conscious that we may need to put in place enabling social and legal environment, you know, for equity purposes. So I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ellen. And that was really powerful intervention in terms of highlighting how the influence of women migrant workers and their voice can really shape policies in the long run, and how pushing back can really shape the migration scenario in the long run. I think is there a question posed to Ishwari, are you
yeah. Okay, so for I think William's question as to like how do you see inclusion, participation, representation even in countries that do have a form of some form of democracy. Even if we look at democracy, I think something that I had earlier kind of highlighted when I was speaking as well, are these spaces, are they appropriately represented? I mean, are migrant workers appropriately represented? Are they responsibly represented? Are they effectively represented? For example, we do have countries that have trade unions that allow, especially within the Gulf, right? So you have Kuwait and you have Bahrain that allow for trade unions? Are migrant workers allowed to form their own unions? Are migrant workers allowed to, let's say, even if they're members, how much of a say do they have within these systems, within the democracy that we see? So this is something that I think that it becomes important to really look at, even when we say it's a democratic setting. How far, even if they're given these freedoms, how democratic is this space? You know, how do we measure how democratic that space is? And that's why it comes down to those three questions, as I mentioned. How does the worker communicate with the state? How does the worker communicate with the state? How the worker is included as a target group in policy making decisions. So let's say, even if they are part of trade unions, even if they are members of trade unions, how far are they really included within policy making decisions? How far are these groups, I mean, these particular groups, how are they included? You know, how far are they able to participate in their own empowerment, in their own representation? So even in reply to Madhu's question as to how is, you know, by and large, a person's, I'm sorry, let me just go back to it. Yes, so isn't it true that, you know, irrespective of whether it's international or local, you know, if you're desperate for a job, you know, you don't have much of a space to negotiate anyways. But I just like to maybe say that I just like to, let's say I'm looking for a job in my own country and I'm desperate for a job in my own country is, I think, intensely different from me moving countries, willing to move countries and look for a job elsewhere. And my desperation is what is pushing me to it. Because even when I am looking for a job abroad, it is not, let's say, a democratic process. It is not as open as I am looking for it in my own country. I am willing as a migrant worker to give up, let's say, the access to labor markets in my own country, my easier access to grievance redressal, my easier access to my social support. I'm willing to give these up in order to participate in another economic system. And when I look at that, even I am not in a position to negotiate because, again, when I'm looking for employment, I'm going through agencies. It's like a funnel. It still comes down and then you get what you get. And you are not allowed in that point of time, if an employer is offering me a job from abroad, there is no sense of communication between me and the employer directly, except for my, let's say, my interview. And maybe as higher skilled workers, they may have a bit more of a space to negotiate. But I think we really need to acknowledge the privilege that higher skilled migrant workers have as compared to lower skilled migrant workers who is not in a position to negotiate or to even talk about their minimum wages in such situations. So yes, so that is something. So as I just like to maybe go into something else, that when we look at, let's say, the right to vote, right to participate, how plural are these political spaces? Another thing is that within countries of destination, migrants may not be allowed to renew their work permits and their visas by themselves. They're not allowed to determine their own status. And this kind of exclusion is also what affects their human rights, in these regions. So even as Ms. Ellen had said, what happened to these essential workers? Why are these essential workers during COVID still considered temporary? So these are some questions I think countries of destination, especially within the Gulf region, will have to introspect. They really need to introspect, because it's not just, and even your question, Ayessa, about the new reforms, about the legislations, about the policies that we see that, that have come out in this post-COVID landscape. We also saw like a wave of reforms during, I think, about 2017, 18, it started around 2015, your flexi visas and all of that. How did it finally function on the ground? What are the different gaps and challenges that we saw, with accessing these, let's say, flexi visas? I think Ms. Nehru is here, and I think we have spoken about it in multiple sessions as well. So, I mean, these are some reforms and legislation and all, that's fine and good. But at the end of the day, what does a migrant worker need? There are several needs that are still not addressed even within these legislations, even within these reforms. And some of those are, let's say, a proper access to social protection, whether migrant workers can access it or whether they are part of it, and how far states are really addressing essential workers. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ishri, and thank you for putting that into perspective for us, especially highlighting the different levels of bargaining power for different types of migrant workers, for those high skilled and low skilled. That's also something that needs to be recognized, that different levels in which they are able to negotiate with their in terms of their employment. And I guess I'm not sure if I missed any questions in the chat box before we move on to the other speakers responding to my questions that I posted earlier. Is there anyone from the
If I may, I'd like
participants who would
to,
like to? Mhm.
yeah, if I may, I'd like to
Yes.
respond to William's comments on
Yes, Ms. Ella, please go ahead.
on Gulf countries do have a form of democracy as is China, Singapore. Given it, how do you see inclusion, participation, representation? Well, again, of course, I already said pushing back continuously is one key to that. But also, for example, in the Gulf, it was unimaginable perhaps for advocates like us to engage directly with the countries in the Gulf. But now, next week, the MFA will be participating as observers in the senior officials meeting. And that is part of the product of advocacy. So I think there is value to it. Beware of too much democracy. Yes, for sure. Yeah. So in the case of Singapore, because Alex is here, how can you advocate for inclusion of migrants? We have a case of a migrant in Singapore, and with the assistance of TWC2 of Alex group, they are able to invoke the rights of these migrants so that he doesn't have to cover the medical bills that has been incurred while when he was in the hospital. So probably these are little things, but in the end, when you get used to it, that there's actually a way out, then people would see that there is a way that is not only like deportation that will be part of the cost that you have to pay, that maybe there is, especially if there are groups in countries of destination that will support your cause. And I see Brother Karim here in Bahrain, of course, Alex very much, the group in TWC2, the JCMK in Korea. All of this can help push back countries of destination, but of course we also have to push back, do our own our homework in our own countries of origin, because it's not only like destination countries that are not exercising, not providing these rights, translating these rights to migrant workers, but we have a lot of shortcomings as well. So I think it's quite important to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ellen. I was wondering if Alex wanted to come in and provide just a short intervention, but of course, I might be putting you on the spot, so it's okay if you don't want to, but maybe just if you would like to provide some input and elaborate.
I have unmuted myself.
Hi, Alex. Sure, go ahead if you would like.
No, I'm always the other voice, I think, in MFA, and I'm always very afraid that sometimes beware if your own wishes come true. We have seen in so many countries, Brexit, for example, as BINOD mentioned, is a classic example, right? Where a majoritarian view can be very oppressive to the smaller marginal groups of a country. So in this whole discussion about democracy and inclusion, I'll always say to ourselves, beware what we wish for. There's something that William mentioned about, he mentioned Singapore and China. So I thought I would say something about that if you let me have a minute more. And it is that there are countries which don't have good formalized democratic systems. But it does not mean that the governments of these countries aren't acutely aware of public opinion. And so how quote unquote democracy is expressed in countries without good, rigorous, formalized democratic systems would be in applying public opinion pressure on the government. It is hardly a good way of doing things. Governments continue to pick and choose which voices they will choose to listen to and which voices they choose to ignore, and furthermore, which voices they choose to oppress. But for example, take China, all right? China has actually come a long way in terms of environmental protection from, say, 25 years ago, without democracy. And yet, and that really came from very grassroots pressure when people were sick and tired of chemical pollution of the waterways, when sick and tired of dirty air. The government began to take notice, and China has, made actually a lot of progress in environmental improvements. So here's an example of democracy sort of in action without formal systems of elections and representation. I think that should be enough for today, just to add food for thought. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I just to a more technical on a technical note, we're coming up to it's 2:30 in Manila or 3:30 in Korea. We actually indicated in the program that it'll be a 1.5-hour discussion, but seeing as we're really having a productive engagement in the session, anyway, the organizers have allotted us 2 hours for the discussion and are allowing us to proceed up to 3 p.m. Korea time. So if it's okay with the speakers and the participants, please feel free to stay on. But of course, if you have other commitments after this, please go ahead. But it would be great if you can stay on. So yeah, we will maybe end the discussion in half an hour or 20 to 30 minutes. So if there isn't, if anyone from the floor has anything further to raise, I will proceed with the speakers to respond to the second round of questions that I posed earlier. I guess we can start with BINOD, if you would like to go ahead. But if anyone from the floor would like to raise something, please raise your hand or send a message in the chat box. BINOD, the floor is yours.
Yes, okay. I think the question that you posed, Shao, was what would be the action points, that can be worked upon. I think one basic step that we mix up in terms of the statistics and numbers. In fact, the statistics is number one objective in GCM. And we think that statistics is a technical issue. It is not a technical issue. It's a very much a social issue. For example, I would like to say that even our bureaucrats and administrators, and more than that, our politicians, the policy makers, are not aware of the basic distinction between flows and stocks of migrants. That, I think, is the extent of ignorance that is there, which needs to be addressed, because the policies are going to be different. Now, we tend to have one size fits all kind of policy, a migrant and every migrant is same. No, the migrants are completely heterogeneous group in terms of the number of years they have stayed in a place, in terms of their gender, in terms of their age, and so on. If we look at just one binary of flows and stocks, every sovereign country has the right to regulate the flows, but to push people back, send them back after 3 generations of living in a particular country is neither desirable nor possible. So that is where the human rights of the people who have been living even illegally or as irregular migrants needs to be guaranteed human rights, because not for charity, but for self-interest of the country, self-interest of the citizens. I tell you why. One is that these people, the illegal immigrants, are on the fringe of society. They do not have proper documents of identification. So they resort to all kinds of, other means of acquiring documentation. And that goes overboard to the extent that they even acquire citizenship documents. That is counterproductive. Other than that, it also leads to a parallel economy, which does not produce taxes, which does not contribute to the gross domestic product of the country. If they are incorporated into the mainstream, then they will be generating, the domestic product, adding to the domestic product, and at the same time, because they will be coming to the formal labor market, and at the same time, they will be contributing to the tax revenue. That is very, very important. I think in the self-interest of this, they need to be given basic rights to education and health. And in the COVID situation, health comes first. That I think in the self-interest that Adam Smith had talked about, the father of economics 400 years ago. But we tend to think that we are doing philanthropy, we are doing charity to the migrants. It is not. That has to be understood. Once we understand this, then I think we will think that the rights that we are giving them as human rights are actually maximizing our own rights, the rights of the citizens. That I think is a vital point that needs to be taken into account in terms of statistics. The statistics would also tell us in terms of, because census takes place once in 5 years or 10 years. If we do not have the data, then we do not have the representation. We do not know the age structural transformation that is taking place. Because the 18 years and above adult franchise is given. How many children are there? How many women are there? How many elderly people are there who even when they have the rights, they cannot move, they cannot exercise it because they are immobile. We have seen that happening in the COVID times. They cannot go even for vaccination. And the vaccines have not been delivered at home. So we see that there are practical difficulties which need to be addressed to incorporate, bring the migrants into the core. So I would say, even to the extent, stick my neck out and say the objective of GCM for safe, orderly, and regular migration. The regular word should be questioned. It should be said, I would say, safe and orderly return migration, or should actually represent the return, because now in the COVID context, the returns, safe return and safe reintegration into the homeland is much more important. And reintegration itself has many questions. I would like to say that we do have a stereotype there who go on harping about integration and reintegration without questioning as to integration with what and reintegration with what, and whether there are counter responsibilities of the other party to integrate with the migrants. That I think is extremely important. So I think the time is limited, but I would say that dignity of migrants are very, very important. Who are important people in the COVID time? Nurses, for example, are in short supply all over the world. We look at WHO proportions, ratios, we find that the global north is very much deprived, and it is very further deprived by the act of migration, because nurses are sought after by the developed countries in the north with very good offers, which is perfectly fine, because as individuals, they have the right to choose that. But what are the home countries doing in terms of creating conditions to retain them within the country? They are being considered as the low-skilled workers. Why should they be called low-skilled workers? I think they are middle-skilled workers, if not high-skilled workers, because there are many layers of nursing services right up to the post-graduation and PhD level education. I would rather argue and connect the points, the dots in terms of remittances also. Who is remitting maximum? We heard about Gulf countries. They are the people who are remitting the maximum to the home countries because they are without families there. The family reunification is another consideration that has to be taken into account. But that, without addressing that, I would say what is the proper use of the remittances? Is there a remittance policy? We go on celebrating the amount of remittances that is coming. India is at the top and this and that, and how much it is going to dip in COVID time. Where is this being used? This is being used for dowries, flashy weddings, celebrations, flashy houses, and so on, but not into education and health. I would say that now that the migrants are coming back home with their accumulated wealth in place of remittances, which is much more than the remittances, there must be a policy of investment. Let there be a priority given to the children of these migrants who have been remitting money in medical schools, in business schools, in other schools, whereby they would be empowered in their own home country and would not leave the country to just go and, you know, contribute their sweat and blood to earn remittances. So these are, I think there are many other issues, but I would not like to monopolize the time, that extra time that has been given. We should certainly have a very critical debate and critical bent of mind rather than going on harping on the cliches and the stereotypes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, BINOD. And I think you really highlighted an important point of, while there is also a need to address the immediate needs that is there in terms of the COVID-19 response, like vaccinations and access to healthcare, we still need to take into account and go into the fundamental human rights that they are entitled to amidst all that. And I guess before I move on to the other speakers, I'd like to do a round of have a round of insights from the participants in the call, in the session. Maybe, of course, I'm putting you on the spot, but if you wish to provide some insight, please feel free to unmute yourself. Maybe I can hear from Vijaya in the call, if she can provide some insights or input on the discussion, just for a minute or two, if we can hear from you, Vijaya from CAS. No. Or from Asia Center. Someone from, I believe we have two representatives from Asia Center. If we can hear some insights or thoughts on the discussion. So sorry to put you on the spot, but of course, if you don't want to provide any input, that's fine. Maybe from, you can hear from Karim Radi.
You hear me? Am I clear?
Yes, please go ahead, sir. I think we're on, yes.
Yes, you hear me? It's okay?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I want to say just this short note that as far as democracy is concerned, then we are talking about groups. No democracy without groups. Democracy is not for individuals, it is for groups. So unless we organize those migrant workers into committees, if trade unions are not possible, I mean, because still, even in the countries where we have trade union movement, still those who are leading the trade union movement don't have the full commitment to engage migrant workers into their unions, because they are afraid also from the community, because the community is not accepting. The community still in some countries, I mean, if I'm talking about Bahrain, the community still look to migrant workers as job stealers who steal job from the locals, even though many jobs being done by migrant workers are not being loved by local, but still the problem is there. So unless we organize those people into groups, I mean, if unions are not possible, maybe we can organize them into communities, into committees. So we cannot talk about having their share in the democracy process. And finally, I want to say that it's not only about concept. I mean, if we speak about dignity, this is fine, but from other side, sometimes this dignity concept play in contradiction with the workers benefit himself. I mean, when any migrant worker come to Bahana, for example, the first thing he want to do is to make a deal with the employer that to hire the shop. To hire the shop from him, and just to give the employer a fixed amount of money monthly, and then he want to work for 14 hours or maybe for 20 hours a day just to earn more. So we have to educate also our worker that it's not only about money. When you go to any of the Gulf countries, it's not only about money. You have to educate our migrant workers before leaving their country. Yes, money is important, but think about working fixed hours. Think about earning fixed amount of money compared with the hours work. Think about having a decent living. Think about having a decent place of work. So all these things have to be educated to the worker before his departure from his country of origin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karim. Thank you for your insights on the discussion. And in the interest of time, I'll be moving on to the last two speakers, as BINOD and Iiswari have already addressed the second round of questions that I've posed to them. So I guess I'll go to Ms. Ellen for now. And also, Ms. Ellen, in addition to the previous question I posed, it would be also great if you can elaborate also, like, from a global perspective, in what particular areas key actors and even mechanisms would play a role in allowing democratic spaces for migrants throughout the migration, especially in the COVID context.
Yeah, thank you, Ayessa. And I think in my earlier intervention, I already made reference to the shortcomings of the duty bearers in terms of addressing concerns of migrant domestic workers vis-a-vis inclusive democracy. But just to add to the good news, because I started with the not so good news, the exclusion of, well, it's not good news, the exclusion of migrant workers, particularly domestic workers, or looking at the gender dimension of it. But just to add that there have been movements and developments along this line to address more inclusive policies, particularly for domestic, for women migrant workers, particularly migrant domestic workers. So I already mentioned that they have started to organize themselves earlier. Then the other issue is, for example, on the applicability of statutory minimum wage. So this is the case in Qatar. I don't know if we have colleagues in Qatar now in the forum, where the minimum statutory wage is applicable to all, including migrant domestic workers. And this should have taken effect last March 2021. So that is something, again, that's good because it's inclusive. The other issue is I've been mentioning about the labor inspection of the households. So of course it doesn't apply on how the Convention 181 has been envisioned 74 years ago, no? But what we're saying is, in the case of the labor inspection of the households, ILO conducted a study in 2016, making recommendations on how it is still possible, still respecting the privacy rights of the household members, to ensure that the workplaces of the migrant domestic workers are safe and are decent, etc. So there are recommendations. So it's not like, oh, we cannot do that because this is not applicable, period. I think that is what we mean when we say keep on pushing back. The other issue is on the right to social protection, the right to social security. Again, I don't think that this is a factor of how much wage you receive. Everybody is entitled to social security. And one case to adjust, if because they have very low income, is in the case of local domestic workers in the Philippines, their contribution to social security is solely covered by the employer if their salary is within this prescribed range. If they go higher than that, then they would deduct a shared contribution, a percentage from the salary of the domestic workers. But if the salary is really low, then this is recognizing that they cannot contribute, then it will be the sole responsibility of the employer, no? And in the ASEAN region, there have been efforts to actually study social security and harmonize. I don't know if there have been progress along that line. The other issue is they have started to set up a grievance mechanism, complaints mechanism, even in the countries of destination. And while a lot are still outside the scope of protection of labor laws, countries in the Gulf, for example, all six GCC countries have enacted domestic workers laws. There have been a lot of observations on how this is being applied. But the point is, again, that this is because of the pressure. So we just have to keep on monitoring and to keep on pushing that these things become really effective in terms of translating the rise of our migrant domestic workers or women migrant workers for that matter, no? On the other aspect, voting rights, I already mentioned that this is being extended already to nationals of other countries of origin, like the Philippines. And I am very happy to report that in terms of the registration for overseas voting for the Philippines, 60% of those who registered are women workers. I mean, they have more barriers to break down, to be able to register and to be able to vote because of their limited mobility, whether you're talking of Hong Kong, which is relatively better in terms of access to transportation and the like. But still, you know, they're able, in the Gulf, it's the same trend. So what I'm saying is, there is a way and they are proving that they can do it. You know, you just have to put the enabling mechanism, no? The other issue is, again, just to say that policies may seem gender neutral. But this is the policy, and then this applies to all. But again, as we have seen in practices, it's not very easily applicable or accessible to women migrants in particular because of many factors, no? And I think this is something that duty bearers and advocates should be very cognizant about and be able to set up affirmative action, enabling environments for purposes of gender equity. Migration governance structure is another issue where we have representation of migrants. They take a seat there, but also they take a seat for a woman representative to represent the women migrants. So again, this is an affirmative action, recognizing that we need to pay particular attention because they are quite vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. No? So I think what I'm trying to say as well is that in terms of addressing the exclusion of women migrants, the overarching recommendation is to ensure that the policies, programs, and services are gender sensitive, gender responsive, and that where it is meritorious and applicable, to set in place enabling social and even legal mechanism for equity purposes. Advocacy must continue. Capability building for women migrants themselves and other migrant rights advocates must persevere and must continue. And maybe just to remind na po ng organizers to wrap up. Okay, so just one final point. I think because the sector we're dealing with are crossing the borders, it is not enough that we concentrate on the laws, the national laws, which are different from one country to another. And that's why I will always give importance on these international human rights norms and labor rights norms of the UN and the ILO. And we are actually, this is a good starting point always to assert, you know, translating the rights of migrants wherever they may be, because they are not supposed to be diminished just because they move from one country to another. So there have been general comments to update, to make these conventions civil political, economic, social, cultural, CEDAW, to respond to the needs of the migrant workers, to the needs of the migrant domestic workers, such as in the case of General Recommendation 26 of the CEDAW. So I think we should continue to monitor what's the development, because the good thing is these covenants and conventions are being updated to make it relevant also to the lives of the migrant workers and the women migrant workers as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ellen. So we're nearing actually the end of the session. Thank you, Ms. Ellen, for highlighting especially the good practices that are out there, which we can move forward with and where we need to move forward, especially in the context of the international community and existing international conventions and mechanisms. And we'll move forward to our last speaker to give her final intervention and final, MISUN, if you can come in and take the floor. Thank you, Ms. Ellen. Go MISUN?
Yeah, I think we don't have much time, but anyway, that, as I said, it's because of COVID-19 crisis, we could find out that our system is broken. So it is very necessary to review and improve the current migrant-related laws and systems by re-emphasizing the importance of the human rights-centered principles of SDGs, whether they are properly included and implemented in current laws and systems in line with international standards, especially the objectives of GCM. And according to the fourth basic plan for sustainable development plan, which was prepared by the Korean government, having experienced the COVID-19 crisis, the government revised and readjusted the plan. And they, of course, the goal 16 always say that to ensure citizen participation in decision making, but here again, efforts should be made to ensure the participation of migrants in decision making. But actually there are already a certain level of participatory system for migrants in local governments. For instance, meeting of foreign residents representatives and foreign resident committee on the local government welfare governance in Seoul metropolitan government. But it is time to make more wide and extensive links with various migrants, grassroots organizations and groups, as what Karim said, that has to be always organization and people's groups to represent their voices. So, so not only current existing space for decision making, but also create space for migrants can speak on their behalf. Including digital area. So creative measures should be prepared to address the problems of lack of information, communication problems, and exclusion of social services, and support experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic and fill the gap between responsive system and reality. While monitoring and implementation of national sustainable development goals, the enactment and implementation of local government's ordinances for foreign residents should also be monitored, because we currently have local government's ordinance for foreign residents, but it should be rechecked and re-examined whether it is really inclusive and whether they have a space for a participatory decision-making process for migrants. So therefore, and finally, I say it is also necessary to examine and reorganize existing migrant support areas and systems, including disaster and crisis situations, as well as verifying false and distorted information about and for migrants to prevent and combat against racial discrimination and xenophobia, so that make society more democratic and inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, MISUN, and thank you for bringing focus as well, the need to reevaluate our current systems at all levels of governance, including at the local level and at the grassroots level. And I think that's a really good way to wrap up kind of the discussion that we're having here. And I would like to thank all the speakers as well for the really valuable insights that we heard throughout the discussion. And just to wrap that all up, to end the session, I'd like to call on William Boyce, the Regional Coordinator of Migrant Forum in Asia, to provide us a kind of wrap up the discussion and provide some closing remarks to end the session. William?
No, thanks, Ayessa, and thanks to all the panelists for a fantastic discussion. I think in many ways you have brought out what the Gwangju Forum is all about, and to highlight it in the words of MISUN just now, to recognize that our system is broken, and BINOD demonstrated that very well in showing how democracy in so-called democratic places, states, is still found and to be lacking. So I think that's already a demonstration that today we have that there's still a long way for democracy. In a certain sense, it's still an unfinished exercise. And inclusive democracy, as BINOD and others have pointed out, is yet something to emerge in the sense of groups that will be left out. Ellen brought that out very well in just one kind of sector of the gender, but I'm sure as she given more time, she would have even spoke about how intersectionality plays into this kind of thing, and how down the line, even if you do have inclusion of women, how intersectionality plays in to play off women groups one against the other kind of thing, based on caste, class, status, race, nationality, and things like that. So I think there's a lot to think about in that sense. I like what Kareem said, that it is an exercise about collective, and therefore I think in the discussions it did come out in terms of spaces, and Ishwari pointed out to this, is about spaces of how do you create these spaces, or how are spaces brought about where voices can be fully understood, fully captured. And that is why I like what Alex also said, that beware of the tyranny of the majority. And that's why democracy is not about the tyranny of majority, but about inclusion. And this is something we've need to come to grapple with. How do we create that inclusion? This might be something to look at as we move forward, particularly for migrant workers. I'd just like to say that I would have liked one aspect I think we didn't have enough time to discuss, is that democracy is never given. The history of democracy has always been that it is fought for. And unless we fight for it, it will never be given to us, because it is always, until today, we are seeing that it is a management exercise and not an exercise of governance. And as long as it is an exercise of management, there will always be collectives that are forgotten, that are left out, that are left on the fringes and marginalized. So I think this is something so important to recognize in this struggle of democracy. So thank you all. You have raised a lot more questions about inclusion of migrant workers, which I think is in the spirit of the Gwangju Forum. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, everyone. We will end the session here, as there is another session that will begin in a moment. So thank you to the speakers, to the participants, and thank you as well to the organizers, the May 18 Memorial Foundation. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, Ayessa. Thank you, William, and thanks all my colleagues and all the audience.
Thank you, Binod. Goodbye, everyone. And sorry, Yujung. We'll leave here.